Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs series at the crossroads of religion and life. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues in the area in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Join us now for this week's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Whodunit is the question associated with mysteries. And the question for us today is, how are mysteries associated with faith? Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church, and your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. And it's with a sense of suspense that today we probe the mystery of faith in the light of that literary genre called mysteries. Helping us in this process is Louise Cole, freelance writer who works with Logos bookstores that specializes in religious detective fiction. And Tony Hilfer, who teaches at the University of Texas and is the author of The Crime Novel, a book published, Tony, I guess how long ago was that?
Last year.
So recent times.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us about how you happened to get into this particular interest.
Well, I've always been an avid reader of mysteries ever since I started with the Hardy Boys at a tender age. And at a certain point, I began to be more interested in crime novels, as I define them, which is a kind of mystery, a detective novel upside down, where frequently the main character will be the murderer rather than the detective.
So you know from the beginning who done it?
Rather frequently you do, yes. And the interest is in how it will all come out, whether in fact anyone else will find out sometimes.
Okay, I'd like to come back to why that twist is significant, that rather than trying to figure it out from the beginning who the culprit is, you know, and I suspect that has some meaning that will be of interest in light of our subject. First of all, Louise, tell us how you gotten into this field.
Well, I started out with the Hardy Boys, too, and Nancy Drew when I was very young. And my mother was an ardent mystery reader, so there were a lot of Mary Roberts Reinhardts and that kind of thing around the house. And I've been reading mysteries since I was about 9 or 10, I guess.
And what happened in later years to
well,
forms that you took to follow that up?
I started, when I lived in New York City for a while and worked in a bookstore there, Shakespeare and Company, and I was given the opportunity to help order for some of the areas of the store. And one of the areas that I chose was mysteries because I pretty well knew the backlist, if not the modern stuff. And then I really got interested in it because there were a lot of writers I hadn't heard about or read before. A lot of new mystery writers who are really wonderful.
Okay. Well, I think that one of the things that has impressed me over the years as working in the church professionally is that I find myself reading mysteries for fun. I mean, that's, I think, why most people, most of the time, get into it, as you both did as young folks. But as the years go by, and particularly from the standpoint of a faith perspective, you begin to see connections. And one of the clearer connections is that you get a number of writers, a number of books that have the church, our religious life, as the setting for murder or crime or some other malfeasance. And what are some of the examples? Tony, let's have you start, since you've just recently written this book on crime fiction. Have you identified anything in that work?
I would say it's not so much church as setting or characters who are clergy or that manner of thing, but thematic, that sometimes the theme of the crime novel has a relation with certain very powerful Christian ideas.
Such as?
Well, I'll give an example. In one where, in fact, you do have the murderer as the main character, and you're really inside the murderer's mind for most of the novel, following his thought processes. It's a book by Dorothy Hughes called In a Lonely Place. There was a movie made of it with Humphrey Bogart, except there the character turns out not to be the real murderer.
Oh, I see.
In a way,
All right.
not uncommon in movies where you don't want Humphrey Bogart to be too bad a fella.
Mm-hmm.
In the novel, however, the real punishment of this character, he is finally found out at the end and caught and so forth, but the real punishment is being that person, is being inside that kind of pit of corrupt self that is the character. And his being caught by the law is almost irrelevant to the sense that the real location of punishment is the being of the person himself, his evil self.
Mm-hmm. I see.
It's suffocating for the reader to be inside this really dreadful consciousness.
I see. So that's an implicit theological statement about hell being in the midst of us, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. What about in other work that you may be familiar with, Louise, where the clergy or figure into it in some way or the other?
Well, I'm kind of a sucker for mysteries that have either actors or clergy in them. So I think my favorite are the Andrew Greeley. Andrew Greeley started a series of mystery novels. Each of the titles is based on the Beatitudes. And the main character and the detective in it is one of his main characters in all his novels, Father Blackie Ryan. And they're very explicitly theological and very often start with a explanation of a theological term. For example, one I think is blessed are the merciful, and he will explain what he means by that and then go right into the mystery novel. I like those very much.
And Greeley himself is a Catholic priest.
Catholic priest, yes. Yes, although I believe the church would be happier if he weren't, but he's...
Okay. Well, I know he's been the subject of some controversy.
Some
over a period of
controversy,
years. But, well, what about like the Father Brown
I like
series?
it, yes, G.K. Chesterton. I think those were the first that I ever read that had a clergy person in them. There's actually, I say clergy person, but I only know of one series, it's a short series of novels where the clergy man is a clergy woman, and there's she's not really a new writer, but I think she's only recently started doing mysteries, Isabel Holland, and her main character is a female Episcopal priest. And they're very interesting. I think I might be a little old-fashioned. I think I prefer the sort of bumbling Father Brown character to this efficient psychologist who happens to be an Episcopal priest.
Oh, I see.
So.
But that's a new wrinkle on it that you
I
have,
think so, yeah. Usually women in these kinds of novels are nuns.
Uh-huh.
I mean, you don't, or the vicar's wife,
Mm-hmm.
and very often are pretty incidental. It's
You have, there was a series by, I can't remember the author's name, but it had to do with a rabbi.
Kimmelman, I believe, Harry
Okay.
Kimmelman.
Uh-huh.
Yes, he went through all the days of the week, was it? Monday the rabbi slept late, Friday the rabbi,
yeah, right.
took a
Uh-huh.
drive. Yes, those are very good. The Rabbi Small, Rabbi David Small is the character in that.
I've wondered whether the Protestant clergy come off as well in these. Are there? I can't think of any one that is, maybe with the exception of the Episcopal priest who's a woman.
Yeah.
But for some reason, the Catholic priests and the rabbis do a better job in detective work than the Protestants do. Is there any explanation for that?
I don't know. There is actually one detective. He's not, I think, formally a minister, but he's certainly a layman, very well versed in orthodoxy and theology. Uncle Abner, these turn-of-the-century books. Melville Davidson Post, I think, wrote them. I'm not even sure of that. But he basically solves his crimes by the use of religious principles, in much the way that Father Brown knows who the guilty person is, not only by logic and by clues, but by virtue of his knowledge of character derived from his religious training.
Yeah, well read in human nature.
Yeah, and as informed by religious faith.
Okay. In the Christian Century publication, there was an article recently, I think maybe we have something on the monitor that highlights the title of that, about Crime and Blessing. It has to do with an analysis of the work of Tony Hillerman, who probably is the best-selling, or among the best-selling of the mystery writers today, with the setting for these at the Four Corners on the Navajo Reservation, and the police, the two tribal police officers who are featured in these, and this Christian Century article was noting how, both in terms of the Indian culture with its sense of the transcendent as represented by these two officers, and implicitly with something of the Christian understanding of evil, that this is all worked out in each of these novels one way or the other. And I shared with you that article ahead of time. Did you have any reflections on that, Louise?
Well, I actually was interested to find out that Hillerman himself is a devout Catholic, and one of the reasons I started reading his books was just because of the strong sense of spirituality in them.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminded me of something Madeline L'Engle said, that no one is a Christian writer. You are a Christian and you are a writer, and your Christianity will inform your writing because it's important to you. Whatever is important to you will inform your writing. And I think that one of the things that is most appealing to people about the Hillerman novels is this sense of spirituality in a kind of non-threatening sense. That is, they're not going to be, people can read them and get a very strong sense of spiritual realities without being required to attend the Navajo religious service every Sunday and have to get up and do that. And I'm fascinated by how much I've learned about the Navajo faith, or the Navajo. It's not actually a faith, is it? It's more just a worldview.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I think the article said that too. That just from the novels, you pick up an amazing amount of information. As a matter of fact, in the Kimmelman, you get a lot of knowledge about Judaism and the practice of Judaism.
One thing that remains with me with the Hillerman novels, and was highlighted by this article, was how the novels have a sense of harmony in the universe. Mm-hmm. The crime is the disharmony, and things are out of balance. And as it comes through the prism of the minds and the intuition of these officers, until they get things back in balance and the harmony is restored, they're not satisfied. And it's almost metaphysical in the way it approaches crime. And I suspect that you've had Tony, as a professor of the literature, you made reference in a conversation we had previously about, like, W.H. Auden picking up on something of that sense of, I don't know if he uses metaphysical as a category, but what was his point of view in his treatment of faith and mystery?
Well, he wrote a classic essay on it that's in most of the collections of great essays on mystery fiction, called The Guilty Vicarage.
Oh, uh-huh.
And he felt that people read crime novels because, like him, they had a deep sense of guilt, and it was assuaged by the crime novel because, as he points out, one of the main functions of the detective is not so much to find the guilty person as to show that everybody else who looks guilty really isn't. All the people that are suspected that turn out to be okay after all, guilty only of, say, lying about an affair or something of this sort, but not the murderer.
Mm-hmm. It's like Agatha Christie always gets the 10 suspects in the room at the same time, and
Yeah, exactly.
Mine are innocent, sort of thing.
And it's a quite brilliant article.
Mm-hmm.
But I really I agree with what you said about the Hillerman novels appealing because of that sense of cosmic order, and the crime being an affront to cosmic order, and therefore the reader invests in the solution of the crime in a way that does have a spiritual relation.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's what some of us are looking for in terms of, we want to be entertained. Mm-hmm. We want to be sort of transported outside mundane reality, which crime fiction can do. But if it at the same time gives you some insight into yourself or into the world and the mystery of existence otherwise, then you feel like you've had your cake and eaten it too. And I've sometimes wondered whether maybe the psychology of crime fiction has that, a little bit of that sense of you get involved. It's sort of like Aristotle's old idea of in tragedy, you get yourself involved, but you can pull back, the catharsis, and that somehow that is cleansing. I hadn't thought about that till just this moment, but do any of you, either one of you, feel that that has an appeal of fiction to folks of this sort?
I'm not sure that it's cathartic so much as that in the world today there's an amazing amount of violent crime, and it's very difficult for, I think, most people to deal with the amount of information, factual information we get about these kinds of crimes. The nice thing about reading detective fiction is that you can go into a world that's very much like our world. It has human beings like us. It operates on the same laws of physics. It looks like our world, except it's tidy. You know,
Tidy.
it's very tidy.
Okay.
The criminal is always caught. Retribution is always swift.
Like poetic justice kind of.
Poetic justice always, you know, and the good people always remain happy unless they happen to be the corpse, and the bad people end up, you know, in jail, or otherwise very often I've noticed recently that people take their own lives when they're found out, and that sort of is even tidier because it doesn't run up court costs. And I think for me, this is one of the real appeals of it, is that you can go in and in a way deal with something like what happens in our world, but on much better terms, much better terms.
So that it has a psychological function in that
Yes.
regard, to feel in the midst of all this chaos and all this violence, there's at least somewhere that justice is done. And does that square with your perception, Tony?
I think so. It's, of course, quite different with the crime novel, because there, in some crime novels, the murderer at the end of the novel has gotten away with the crime. Patricia Highsmith wrote The Talented Mr. Ripley, where you keep waiting for him to get caught after he's committed 2 murders, and at the end of the novel, he lucks out, almost as if there was a reverse providence watching out for him. And he goes on for 4 more novels after that to commit more murders. Although the victims are usually not too nice people, so that you don't get too horrified. But there are novels crime novels that deal with the violence without that kind of safety net that I think you very acutely pointed out, that operates in the standard detective novel. One instance I'd give is of a writer who usually did write detective novels, but wrote one crime novel amidst them, and that's Nicholas Blake, who really was, of course, the English poet and poet laureate C.D. Lewis, who wrote a book called The Beast Must Die. And in that, the hero, who's one you really like and identify with, is a man whose son is killed by a hit-and-run driver, and devotes the rest of his life to finding out who the man is and taking vengeance. In the course of doing that, he finds that this man is father to a son who he is destroying psychologically in a manner parallel to the way he had destroyed the hero's son physically. And he does finally kill him, less by then to avenge his son than to save the man's own son, who he's gotten into a kind of paternal relationship with. But then to protect his victim's son from being accused with a crime, he has to go out to the Atlantic Ocean on a small sailboat during a storm, and obviously give up his own life. And the book is called The Beast Must Die, out of Brahms's 4 serious songs, which paraphrase Ecclesiastes. The beast must die and the man must die also. So the theme there is really very directly Christian, in that it's sacrificial.
And it makes me think, too, that the way you describe it, crime fiction is more dealing with the complexities of life, as distinct from being tidy, like we were talking about before. It's even to the point of saying that almost the one that you were mentioning earlier is the author implying that crime pays, that crime does pay if the person's getting away with it?
I think what I read a lot about Patricia Highsmith, and in an interview with a German magazine, she admitted that she was somebody who felt guilty and stayed awake at nights when she was late getting a library book back. So she's bothered by a overweight superego, you might say. It seems kind of logical that she would find a real relief in developing a character who feels no guilt whatsoever
I see.
for committing something as blatant as a murder.
Well, maybe one way of working out some of her own dilemmas, it sounds
Yes.
like. Well, there's another title here that I think we can feature that will give us a little bit of a different slant. Sleuths in the Parish. This came out another of the Christian Century publications, and the point that was made there that I resonated to was that it said that detective work, as is represented in these novels, is something like work that a pastor does in the parish in terms of perceiving what's beyond the surface. I mean, a person comes in for counseling, as just a simple example, and there's what might be called the cover story, the presenting issue, and then there's the real story. And this, you don't have to be a pastor to do this. I mean, any counselor is aware of the fact that body language says one thing, the words may say another, but nevertheless there is a process of being aware of realities that are not immediately apparent. And there's a connection there, it seems to me, of sleuthing that is very much like what you might read in some of these stories, especially the ones that are, I think, more sensitively done. Do you think of any examples in the literature that might be parallel to that, Louise?
Oh, I don't know that I can think of one right offhand. It seems to me, though, in general, it's there's a lot in common between parish work, the work of a pastor and the work of a detective, except the main difference is, of course, that the pastor's job is not to punish at the end. Father Blackie Ryan, back at in the Greeley Mysteries, is very good at it. You never know who did what at the beginning of those books, and everyone seems either equally guilty or equally innocent. But he, because of his long work in the parish and his knowledge of the families and whatnot, is always seeing beneath the surface on that. I think in almost every detective story, that's going on. Because, of course, the person who did it is not standing up there going, I did it, you know. They're standing there going, I'm a good, upstanding citizen, and there's no reason to suspect me at all.
Okay. You have any other thoughts along those lines, Tony?
Oh, yeah. There's a convention in almost every of the standard kind of detective novels that operates, and it's the means by which the detective solves the crime. And it's not usually so much the discovery of a new clue or a new fact that no one else knows, which after all would be just a virtue of diligence. It actually comes from his being able to see the facts already there and they're in front of everybody else too, but to see them from a new angle.
A different angle,
Yeah.
right.
It's what I call, I think the term's been used before, perspective shift. And I think that might well operate in counseling and pastorship as well, that you can come and people bring you their problems and they're almost bored with their own problems. They've run over them so much in their own mind. But what they haven't been able to do is take a new position toward that set of problems, to see them in a different way. And
Right.
frequently that's what the counselor can bring to them. Like, here, take all these things which you've been telling me about, but look at them this way instead of
Right.
that way.
You know, one of my favorites in this regard is Ross MacDonald, who I think taught literature before he got into the field of being full-time mystery writer. And you read the dialogue in Ross's novels as distinct from John MacDonald's novels, and sometimes it's like counseling that's going on. There's a listening, it's empathetic, there is a intuition that goes to the heart of things and cuts through a lot of external subterfuge kind of thing. And I feel that that is really edifying literature, because even though it's dealing with crime, it somehow you feel after you're done with it that it's had what the Supreme Court might have called a social redeeming purpose. You're growing through it. And we have just a couple of minutes left. Just share with us quickly, in each case, where you feel growth has occurred with you as a result of this interest.
I think I've become more. The idea of motive, for me, is central. I read the sort of more British type detective novels, and motive is always one of the major components of the detective's work in that. And it has, I realized over the past few years that that's the part that I've become much more interested in. The crime is clearly a crime or not a crime, but what's really interesting is the human being
So
and why they
become
did
more
it.
aware of that motive
Become more
aspect.
aware, and more aware in people that I deal with daily, too,
Okay.
because of that.
In about 10 seconds, tell us, Tony, what it's done for you.
Well, I'll give a particular example. There's a novel by Simenon called La Neige était noire, The Snow was Black, where the character really repents of his sins at the end. There's a whole process of sin and repentance worked through that I find very affecting.
Well, I think that you've been very effective with us today as you've shared your insights and your experience. And I think as we offer our thanks to Louise Cole, Tony Hilfer for being here, we're glad to have you folks look in and hope that you've benefited from these insights. There's an article that was once written that indicated that in any whodunit, you can always be sure that the clergy didn't do it. Well, there may be some debate about that, but there's no debate about the value of this genre for our understanding of faith's mysteries. I'm Richard Thompson, thanking you for watching. Welcome you to be back again next week for the next edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Peace be with you. For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at